As you heard this segment, we're going to be talking a little bit about ground handling techniques in stronger winds and lighter winds. My dad's out of studio for a minute, so I'm going to start this topic off. And one of the things I'd like to point out is something that I've noticed over the years, and that is that whether you're in real strong wind or real light wind, the techniques you're going to want to use to handle your glider are going to be the same. Giving too much brake input when you're either in light wind or strong wind is going to be a problem, because in light winds, give too much brake input, you pull the glider right back down. In stronger winds, you pull too much brake, and the glider is going to lift you up and pull you backwards. In both light winds and strong winds, it's going to be really important that you use a lot of roll input on the ground, which means you're going to have to be twisting your hips left or right with the glider, because again, for reasons I just mentioned, you're not able to use as much brake input, so your roll authority of the glider becomes a lot more important. Strong winds, I don't know, I guess that'd be anything over 15 miles an hour. Light winds would probably be anything less than 4. In either one of those situations, where your center of gravity is also going to be really important. You will not be able to launch a glider standing straight up in strong wind or in light wind. You're going to have your body down low in both of those scenarios, because again, in the lighter winds, if you're standing straight up, you won't be able to load the wing, you won't be able to move forward fast enough, the glider will drop back, you have to start all over again. In stronger winds, it'll drag you back. So I was just saying, Dad, before we got into this topic too much, I wanted to make clear that the techniques for handling the glider in really light winds or really strong winds are pretty much exactly the same. You want to be really subtle in both cases.
Right.
You want to use very little brake input and a lot of roll roll control. For obvious reasons.
Yeah, and I'll say something that I do notice quite frequently, and it might be of use to some of the pilots. I notice that many of the pilots out there, from time to time, will adjust their brake toggle length. The brakes do come sometimes rather long, and pilots sometimes don't want to do a wrap. And so they shorten the lines on the brake toggles, and shortening sometimes maybe just a few inches, 6 inches, whatever the case. But then when they start kiting their glider, either in the reverse or the forward, I often see, and oftentimes they don't even notice it until you point it out, that when they're lifting the risers up, they're pulling the risers up after they've shortened the toggles, that there is a slight deflection in the trailing edge because the brake lines have been shortened. And oftentimes that affects the clean lifting up of the glider in a light wind, particularly because you're giving it a slight conflicting demands. You're saying come up, and at the same time you have a slight deflection on the trailing edge. It's not going to come up clean. It's going to come up a little bit more difficult. In a real strong wind situation, then that situation becomes even more magnified. So those are little things that sometimes pilots do that inadvertently affect how the glider does ground handle. So when you make these adjustments on your brake, just be aware of that if you do happen to adjust your brake length.
Even if you didn't adjust it, gliders that are more than 4 or 5 years old, the lines on the trailing edge tend to shrink anyways. So that's always been an issue as well, the A's and the B's lengthening, and then the D's and maybe the brakes shrinking, and that just overall changes your angle of attack and just makes it that much more difficult to control the wing. So, having said that, you have some.
Yeah,
we've got Murray on the line also.
Thanks, Murray, for joining us back. It's nice to have you with us. Murray, if you have some things that you'd like to share, please pop in anytime.
Well, it's a favourite one, and it's slightly topical for those that like watching people getting abused on the various news groups, because there seems to be this view that it's totally impossible to cross-brake reverse launch in zero wind. Now this fits in quite nicely. I think the next edition of the magazine, which is either out in the States just now or should be out very shortly, has an article specifically on this type of thing. Most pilots, whether they're forward or reverse launching in light conditions, essentially they're trying to drag the wing into the sky. Now if you think about a pilot running forward 10 feet He's not trying to move the wing 10 feet. If he's running at 10 miles an hour, he's trying to move the wing a quarter of an arc plus 10 feet. So if he moves forward at 10 miles an hour and expects the wing to be above him, he's actually asking it to move at almost 40 miles an hour. So I think one of the keys is pilots have got to learn to fly the wings up, particularly with the more modern wings, which are so much better than this, than the earlier large cell opening DHV-1 wings. Even a 1-2 now or a 1 is much more aerodynamic.
Absolutely. So that means lifting the glider instead of pulling the glider.
Yeah, flying the glider up. One of the key things I do is if I see somebody that's struggling, particularly somebody that's been flying for a few years, I'll clip from their glider, or unclip it from their harness straight onto my harness. Exactly the same position, exactly the same conditions, and I'll park the brakes. I won't even touch the A's, and I'll just use my weight to carefully rock the glider and launch it without touching any controls. Most pilots over-control their glider. They tend to overdo inputs rather than let the glider get on with flying.
Another tip I think that will help our listeners if you're having some problems, quite frequently, even though Murray has suggested that you lift the glider and not pull the risers, and we're talking
fly
about
the glider up rather than lift it.
Right.
Yeah.
I suggested the lift, not pull.
Yeah, and, this lift, not pull. What will help you lift the glider and not pull the glider is this: when you place your hands on the A's, that you don't grasp the A's. Do it with an open palm, and basically all you're doing when you're lifting, you're pressure inputting the glider, so that if one wing's coming up a little slightly faster, a little more pressure on the opposite side will bring that wing, catch it up to the faster side. So when you tend to grab the risers, inevitably I see so many of the newer pilots pulling the glider up with their hands, or they're just pulling, and that causes oftentimes the glider not to come up as smooth, as clean, and as quickly, and oftentimes results in deflation or deformation as it comes up. Whereas lifting with your open palm, that resolves the problem very simply.
One of the big problems we see with European pilots that are visiting is with the very light wind thermic conditions and traditionally hour-long flights. They tend to do much, much longer flights, but maybe only do one flight in a day. Is one of the favourite techniques seems to be to hold both A's in one hand and both back risers in one hand. Now that is quite a good technique in that it removes some of the problems that pilots can get with the full cross-brake reverse launch, where right hand holds the left A and left hand holds the right A, which is just as you see it. But it removes any weight shift control from the harness.
Right.
In other words, if you turn left and right, you can very efficiently roll control a glider from the wall up, rather than when you hold both A's in one hand, you're actually taking out all the really significant weight shift control you can have and relying on just using sort of a bit of juggling.
It's relying on power. The compound technique actually is a powerful technique to use in high winds, but it also is a technique that you're basically just using upper body power, and you lean back in your harness, of course. But the point is that you're right. The risers, unless you let them slip through your hands while you're rolling your hips, you can't input any hip if you have both the A's and the rear risers locked, so that the carabiner are not sliding or moving through your hand. So
the big problem we see is the Continental pilot will pull it up, stronger wind conditions, and the glider's got a slight roll to it, and because they're pulling it up that way, they're stuck with that, and they're really struggling, and they're getting dragged sideways.
The more they pull, the more it accelerates.
Yeah. Whereas if you can just turn your weight, so if you turn to the right, what you're actually doing is you're shortening the right riser, which as you look cross brake is going to what appears to be the left wing, and you're lengthening the left riser. And that is, you turn sideways 90 degrees and you're actually moving your risers by a couple of feet. That's a big, big control. So clearly, if you don't know about this, this can add errors. But if you do know about it, it's a very, very strong method of delicately, smoothly, and efficiently controlling.
Another couple of things that I'd recommend that work really well in light winds and stronger winds is that if you remember that your arms are there not really to lift or pull the wing, it's really just as a leverage point.
Yeah.
Because the carabiners would be too low of a leverage point. So when the glider's coming up, your arms need to be making the same arc that the glider's making, as opposed to you trying to pull the riser towards you or you trying to lift the glider too much. It's just going to keep an even arc with the wing. Another thing also is that if you're doing the reverse, most people, especially in lighter winds, when they want to do a reverse inflation, they'll run backwards and they'll lean their hips forward and push their upper back backwards, like they're leaning back in a chair. And I think people do that because they can run faster, but the problem is as soon as you move your hips forward, you're moving your CG closer to the canopy, so it's just making it that much more difficult to pull the wing up, when in fact probably the better way to do a reverse inflation in light winds or strong winds is to not lean your upper back backwards so much, which could do some back damage, but more push your butt down and back. So as opposed to letting
tug of war position.
What's that?
Tug of war position.
Exactly, a tug of war position as opposed to I don't know, standing up straight and arcing backwards.
Yeah, the only thing with that I would stipulate, and that's the martial artist in me, is that you have to stay balanced, and balance is keeping your nose and your belly button in a straight line.
Good point. One of the things in that, again, what we do is we have hips in line with the wing, but the stance split. Most people have a natural tendency to turn slightly sideways, which is where the 2 A's in one hand comes in, because you don't cause the glider to do anything. But what we teach pilots to do is to stand straight to the wing, but with 1 foot forward, 1 foot back, and then you can rock your weight both up and down, backwards and forwards in quite a large circle area.
Right.
Keeping control and staying in balance.
Absolutely.
I think that's it's very interesting in the conversation. Hopefully our listeners can see this, that there's very few techniques that you wouldn't use in light wind that you can't use in high wind. In other words, the techniques are the same. I mean, the difference is the velocity of the wind tends to dramatize these effects much faster and more dramatically.
Shows up any feelings.
But again, it's staying balanced, staying centered, facing the glider, and when you step back, not stepping back to input the riser, so that now all of a sudden your half step back has pulled one riser in 6 more inches or 12 inches more, which also inputs the glider. So we see a lot of these little subtle things that we do. Oftentimes we can get away with it in light wind, and we get spanked in high wind when we do these things. So another technique that I think I see overused, and that's overusage of brake, because as you've pointed out, both of you have pointed out, when you're using your body in conjunction with some of these other techniques, you don't have to rely solely on brakes. And so one of the things that happens is that people will oftentimes pull down on the brake and leave their hand down. What I try to emphasize in controlling the glider as we're kiting is tapping. In other words, full extension tap and let up, and not holding the brake down as you're bringing it up.
A short time, but quite a lot of brake produces very little drag and has a good control input. But it's when you hold it there, that's when the wing starts dropping back, and as you say,
you're fighting it. Yeah.
The other thing is we use the tip lines. Because if you need, say, 5 kilos of drag on the wing to control it, if you put 1 kilogram of drag right out at the tip, that will do the same control movement.
Right.
So there's a whole load of ways. But again, it all comes back to if in safe conditions in the flat field, you can use a high-performance wing, where as soon as you put in a little control movement, it has a directly observable effect, then that will help you with the normal flying on your normal wing.
Right.
Pilots need to be aware of what's actually happening, and a lot of times with the very well-designed modern wings, they're actually designed to minimize inputs and to control them and keep them in a safe range.
Absolutely. And yeah, absolutely. And that's actually, Dad, that's one of the reasons why I actually recommend to the students to not so much tap, but to just give a little bit of input and hold it and wait, and then if they need a little bit more, hold it and wait. Because the gliders are designed to be given less input. They fly better with less input. And a lot of times when people start to start to, swing their arms back and forth, they'll tend to over-input the glider. And the problem is that when you do that, because you're doing it so quickly, you're not getting any response from the glider. And so you tend to keep doing it and keep doing it. Whereas if you just give, an inch or two a break and just hang on to it and count to 3 and then maybe another inch or two after that, you probably will be able to control the glider a little bit easier.
I would actually go more with what David says there, and you put in a reasonable amount of input, hold it for a few seconds, leave it off, and then wait for that control input to actually become visually apparent. I would tend to go more that way.
Yeah, the student, unfortunately, or the newer pilot, oftentimes doesn't just give it a subtle input. They usually cause it to drop down and fall back, and that's the problem. If the glider's not overhead, it's not flying, therefore it's not easy to work with.
Which is why I recommend that they give subtle brake input as opposed to yanking the brake down.
No, it's a tapping the brake. It's a full motion extension and back up, so that the extension, if you tell them to make a full extension and let it right back up, oftentimes is more specific than saying just a little slight, because a little slight one time will mean he's only pulling it 3-4 inches. The next time it's 2 or 3 feet. In other words, the student oftentimes, or the newer pilot, doesn't really have a full control and full, it's not going to be the same every time with that just slight input thing. And what happens is when the glider starts falling back, they tend to let their hands come down even more. In my
Not
experience.
if they're up here, but if they're down here.
Yeah, I wouldn't go for the full input. I would go for maybe about a third of the input range. Gabriel, what would you say if you're pulling on about a third, ease off, see what happens?
Yeah, that's fine. The reason I'm against tapping is because I see too many people come tapping when they're landing, tapping when they're taking off, tapping when they're kiting.
Chicken flapping.
Right, that's what it leads to. And the reason why, for me, tapping, if you tap the glider, you're not getting you don't get a lot of response back from the glider if you're constantly in motion. So you give a little bit of input and wait. Give a little bit more input.
Got to give it time.
Yeah. The problem is that we're brought up in a society now where we have Porsches and BMWs that have instantaneous acceleration when we step on the gas, and people are expecting the same kind of performance from a paraglider, and it's no matter what the design is. When you give it input, you will not feel an immediate reaction. It'll take a couple of seconds, 2-3 second delay.
Again, that ties in with the article. I mean, I've done a rough estimation, and on the Vertex 24, lay it flat, and you have about 27 square meters. For the same weight range, the DHV-1 wing is 30 square meters. Now, allowing for the fact that it's thinner at the tips and the trailing edge, that means you've got about, it's a ballpark guess, you've got, say, about 10 cubic meters of air in the wing. And that is sort of 8.5 kilos.
Absolutely.
So you're talking about the wing up there, add the material, you're talking about 15 to 20 kilos of wing. It's going to take time to move and to stop moving.
Especially when you can only give it input. If you're only giving it input through the brake, which is, a single control line, being divided each time it goes up. Murray, we're going to have to take a break.
I'm going to have to save my phone bill, so
okay.
I'll bid you, gentlemen, good day, and you never know, I'll phone in later, but better watch my phone bill.
All right. Thank you so much for the call, Murray.
Bye.
This is the Paragliding Radio Talk Show. We're going to take a break. We're going to be right back with you in just a moment.